As human beings, we have an innate need to understand and make sense of things. We're not content to just go along and just to do. In fact, one of the biggest and the most common acts of rebellion is when someone tells you to do something and it doesn't make any sense. We have a deep and innate need for things to make sense, and beyond that, for things to have meaning. Whether it's just a passing curiosity or a need to understand some random tragedy, we cannot help but ask, why? We see this innate need in children as they begin to notice the world around them and as they absorb the world. What is the most common thing that they say? Why? It is so unfortunate that as they grow older, and especially with the dawn of the age of technology, that this wonderfully bubbling curiosity gets so stunted and stifled by overly entertained technology. My children know that I like to overly vilify technology, but I really do think there is a satanic element in technology. As much as it has potential for good, it also has equal potential. Because we don't have to be curious. We're constantly aroused. We're constantly entertained. We're constantly medicated. And whatever time and space there might have been for curiosity or wondering is taken up by this handy device where you can entertain yourself ad nauseum with things meaningful as well as insignificant. But still, despite the ways in which our lives consume us, or the ways in which we as adults understand and we feel like we know a lot, there are times when even in our busy, hectic, distracted lives, there come moments when we as adults cannot help but wonder why. There's a particularly difficult part of the why when it turns into a why me? Why me? Not just why in general, but why did this happen to me? Or why did this happen to someone I love so dearly? You know, I give a version of this message at almost every church that I go to and am invited, where I talk about the problem of pain and of suffering and how we make sense of this. But this came to me at a very particular dilemma in ways that even I had a hard time kind of coming to terms with very recently. When I was sitting there, when I happened to be visiting the Park family at what seemed like probably the lowest moment of their struggle. And right after that meeting, I sent a desperate text out to the church leadership asking desperately for their prayers. They were having a particularly difficult time, and we were debating. We were set to go and visit them, David and I, on a Friday afternoon. But then they said, oh, you know, Matthew's having a particularly bad day. But I can tell by Mike's posting on Facebook that they were also probably at one of their lowest moments. And I just felt that there was some kind of a satanic element of just discouraging them so deeply. And part of that was to kind of, you know, and so I kind of imposed a little bit and said, look, we just want to come and just pray with you and pray for you. We're not going to, you know, do anything. And so we got there. But just as we arrived, indeed, Matthew was having one of his painful fits. And in his pain, as we tend to do, we push people away. It's just too hard in the midst of our pain to really actually have the space in mind to engage. And as I walked into their room, they were taking, Mike was taking Matthew out, and Frances just broke down into utter tears. I'm sure she had cried many times up until that point, but these were tears of just utter desperation and utter despair. Her mother happened to be there, and I had just entered the room, and I was at a loss. I'm a psychologist, I'm a counselor. I teach people how to counsel in these situations. And I was utterly at a loss as to what to do. And so I just went in. I mean, her mother was embracing her. There was nothing else we could do. I just put my arms around them and just sobbing, half praying. I just held them and prayed. And after that, we left. left the food that we brought from Dulce, my favorite place, that USC Village. I brought them the best food that I could imagine. Chocolate donut included. And those of you who've tasted, Clark and Grace, you know. But as we also prayed with Mike, and then as we were driving home, I was very quiet and I was telling David, that was really, really hard. My faith, it's not so that much that my faith was tested, but you know, just given where I am in my faith journey and having dealt with the problem of pain, and I've rarely felt this kind of, God, where are you? Where are you? Why is it that you seem so impotent when you are an omnipotent God? I really, really struggled. And I thought, God, you know, you have the power in that moment. Just go like that, and everything could be fixed. And we had been praying, and we continued to pray. And yet, things didn't seem to be getting any better. And to see them in that moment of despair, I couldn't help but cry out to God and say, why? Why aren't you doing something about it? And so I think there's a particular kind of a why and a particular kind of dilemma when we encounter pain and suffering, whether it's in our own lives or especially as we see it in the lives of those around us, the people that we care for. And we have this need to make sense of and understand how it is as Christians we can make meaning and sense of the question, why? In a way that's different from the secular world who doesn't believe in God. Because what do they resort to? In the absence of God, how do we make sense of the why? You tell me. I'm going to pick on Kuan because he's Chinese. What are the Chinese most obsessed with beyond food? Everything has meaning and everything is intended for something. What is it? Besides food.
Besides food?
Yes, besides food. Luck. Luck. In the absence of God, everything is random. And so what do? You try to do everything and anything to enhance your random chance of luck. That's all we have. Yeah. And so everything is lucky. This, numbers are lucky, colors are lucky, this is lucky. Oh yeah, Marianne's here too, so I can pick on her too. I have never seen a society so obsessed with luck and fortune, right? But it's all based on some random. So in the face of randomness, you create a pseudo-God, and that's you, that there's something you can do, like use certain numbers, or do things on a certain day, or eat this kind of food. And these are all our desperate attempts to enhance the thing that one thing we can't control, which is fate and luck. So I don't know what's worse, just believing in luck and randomness, or struggle with this dilemma of believing in an omnipotent, all-powerful God who could, with the snap of a hand, change everything. So I think this particular dilemma presents us with a particular opportunity. And I would say not only an opportunity, but an obligation. And the obligation is this, that as Christians, that part of what it means to be a Christian is for us to understand for ourselves what is God's answer? What is it about our faith and our belief that differentiates us from the world? And to be able to understand who God really is in relation to his love, in relation to his power, in relation to human suffering, and be able to understand that and be able to convey in that moment of pain and suffering in people around us a right understanding of God, and not contribute to a distorted misunderstanding of God. And it is precisely in our own understanding that we receive the blessing, and in turn, we can be a blessing, a true blessing to others in their suffering and in their pain, whether or not they believe in God. So this is the very difficult and very deep and challenging subject that I want to, for us to deal with today. I would say that there are 3 types of suffering that I can identify at least. Okay, I'm sure there's more, but the 3 that are most obvious to me are, 1, the kind of suffering that is a direct cause and effect relationship. One that we know that we have contributed to. So if I'm a smoker and I've been a lifelong smoker and I became an Adventist and I stopped smoking, but I contract lung disease, I don't think it's one of those situations where I'm going to say, why God? Right? Okay? I mean, it's unfortunate. Yes, I know I'm going to suffer, but it's not one of those things that really is going to be a kind of a spiritual crisis of sorts. So I think we can kind of set that aside when there's direct cause and effect relationships, or where we can see the causality of certain kinds of suffering, whether it's valid or not. The other kind of suffering the other 2 types of suffering that I'll address today are a little bit more difficult. One is when it's so unfair, when it's unwarranted, and the kind of suffering that is tragic in the sense that we suffer at the hands of those around us unfairly. Especially when we suffer at the hands of those who should love us the most. That's when it's really hard. And this is the realm that I work in the most in my line of work. Whether it's in a marriage or especially family of origin issues, where children have grown up with parents who at minimal, at worst, at least are just incompetent, aren't able to provide, aren't able to care for their children, but at worst, where the very people who are to love you the most are the ones who intentionally and directly inflict the greatest harm. And this is where I talk about the whole gamut and the range of abuse. There's something deeply, deeply invalidating to a human being when the very people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who inflict the greatest harm. And the psychological damage and the message that these children from very young just internalize can only be what? My parents don't love me because I must not be lovable. As children, that's kind of the automatic and natural message that psychologically they internalize and say, if my own parents do not love me, then it must be that I am not lovable. And the most important and powerful shift in the paradigm of thinking that is so critical to their own growth and development is to understand that it is not that they are not lovable, but it is because their parents are not capable of loving. That's a very, very different kind of a paradigm. It's easy enough to say, but so, so hard to make that shift when that way of thinking and feeling has been ingrained in them from early childhood. But when we suffer at the hands of others, especially unfair kinds of things, then we can't help but wonder why. Why? And finally, I think the third type is just random suffering. Like the Park family, I think part of why it's so hard is that, when this thing happened, we're all wondering why. Anytime we hear about any kind of tragedy, the first thing we want to know is why. Like, what happened? Right? Our first thing is like, what happened? Well, he just caught a flu. He wasn't feeling well, and then all of a sudden he started to feel numbness and paralysis from his feet all the way up, and then it turned into excruciating pain. And before we know what's happened, he's in the hospital, and we're hearing that he may never be able to walk again. That's just utter craziness. How do we make sense of that? Even when medical speaking, it is a flu. What are the chances of that? 1 in a million. Absolutely. It is precisely in those kinds of situations where, again, this question of the why and the need to make sense of the senseless really compels us and challenges us, especially as Christians. I'm going to tackle the second issue, the first one first, meaning how do we make sense of human suffering when it is at the hand of others? So I'm going to try to do this quickly because it's a story that is familiar to us. But I think one way to understand that, and one of God's answers to the problem of pain and injustice and personal human tragedy is through the story of Joseph. Right? So we all know the story of Joseph, but I'm going to kind of dig through it from a psychological kind of family perspective. If you think about Joseph, who is his grandparents? Grandparents. Isaac and Rebecca. How did they meet? Match made in heaven.
That's true.
Okay? You could say that. Now, this is every Christian couple's fantasy. There's a match made in heaven, you know, and there's some big sign, and someone prays, and lo and behold, they just show up, and you get married, and happily ever after. That's the Christian fantasy. Well, I'm sorry, but the Christian fantasy of the happily ever after is about as fairy tale princesses. Why? Because if you read between the lines, Rebecca and Isaac did not have the happiest marriage. Why? Anytime parents favor one child over the others that much, there's something going on. Let me just tell you that. Favoritism is not a good sign. And that Isaac so favored Esau, and that, you know, Rebecca so favored Jacob, to the point where they were doing that kind of extreme, not a healthy dynamic. Okay? So we don't know much about their marriage, but we can surmise. Okay? So what is the product of that less than ideal, healthy, happy marriage? Is that the son deceives the father, the other brother wants to kill. This is like Korean drama. Okay, they got the original script from the Bible. And this family is forever, until restored in heaven, you know, separated. They never are healed as a family. That is a tragic family. Honestly, if you ever thought of it, it's a tragic family story. The children, Jacob never gets to see his parents, okay? And the mother never gets to see her favorite son and all of that. So you think, well, then it gets worse. So we know Jacob runs off to his uncle, who does what? You tell me. What does he do? He deceives him, exploits him, right? And then, you know, you have this guy who loves one sister but marries the other, and then, you know, this is literally Korean drama, love triangle, and then they're scheming and conniving and all of this, and in the midst of all of this comes Joseph, right? So you can see that, you know, so we know the story of Joseph. So if you think about it, why, you know, we blame his brothers. Yes, they hated him so much. What did they want to do initially? Kill him. Honestly, they weren't about to sell him. They wanted to kill him. Do you know why they didn't kill him? Reuben, the oldest brother, had enough sense to say, no, let's not kill him. Let's just sell him off. But literally until that point in time. Yeah, we overly focus on the brothers, but think about it. What must Joseph have done to get his brothers to hate him that much? Literally, you don't hate your sibling for no reason that much. I mean, you may not like them, you know, but you don't get to a point unless there's something going on. Okay? So we're going to pick up the story where Patriarchs and Prophets describes where Joseph, and I'm talking to the gentleman over here, because guess what? Joseph was about your age when the unthinkable and the unimaginable happens to him. He is the pampered, spoiled, has everything. We won't get into how many basketball shoes. But besides that, pretty much everything that they are the darling of the family, right? And I hope certainly that nothing so tragic ever happens to our children, but I guess I would also caution you gentlemen and say you never know. No, it's not a threat. It's really not a threat. We just never know with life. And so I think the unimaginable happened to Joseph. Joseph. But he, according to Spirit of Prophecy, he was about 17, 18, around that time. Prime of his youth, pretty much spoiled. And even though he grew up in his father's household, wasn't really a true believer. But in that moment when he is being dragged off to Egypt as a slave, in the far distance, he sees his father's tents, nestled up against the hills in the middle of the oasis of palms. So close and yet so far. And according to Mrs. White, she says that in that moment he grew up. And in that moment of crisis, a decision point, he could have shaken his fist at God and said, why me? And maybe added some expletives and said, forget it. Instead, it was at that point of dilemma where he says, I'm going to be true to the God of my father. It was at that point that the God of his father became his own God. And I challenge each and every one of us that in our moment of pain and in our moment of crisis is a dilemma and a decision point. Do we turn our backs on God or do we embrace him? So we know the story. He goes off and he's very faithful. And he goes from this spoiled, petulant kid who probably did no chores, no nothing, right, to someone who is a slave. So you can imagine that transformation. Guys, just imagine it. Just for our indulgence. Think about what that might be like. Yeah? So he's faithful and he rises in the household of Potiphar. And just when you think things are going well, what happens? He is falsely accused for doing the right thing. Now just imagine yourself, Joseph, and maybe let's say that by that time he's in early 20s. Okay, let's say that he's like 20, 23, 24, 25 at the most. Okay? You are at the prime of your youth. And maybe now it's been long enough that he's just kind of forgotten a little bit about the pain and trauma of being sold into slavery by his own family and his own brothers. And maybe he's gotten over the sense of despair. And maybe he sees some glimmer of hope in his new environment. And he's making the best of it. And he's trying to be faithful and true to God. And in that moment, what happens? Probably worse than being sold into slavery, I would think, in some ways. He's falsely accused and imprisoned. Now imagine yourself at 23, rotting away in an Egyptian jail. And for all you know, that's the rest of your life. How are you going to feel then? Honestly, very honestly, at that point, I probably would have shaken my fist at God and then said, I'm sorry, F you. I think emotionally, that's kind of the raw human sense of, this is what I get? Why me? You know, the first one, okay, maybe I had some perspective and maybe I contributed a little bit, but not to the point of being sold. But this is utterly and incomprehensible as to trying to make sense of that. But we can fast forward to the dramatic ending. So if you have your Bibles, turn with me to Genesis 45. So we know how the rest of the story unfolds. You know, he rises, he becomes second in command in the greatest country of that time, the most powerful nation of that time. And he becomes second to Pharaoh. And just when he feels like he's been kind of healed and has forgotten all of that, because now he's in such a good place, what happens? His brothers, out of nowhere, appear before him. And all of a sudden, all of that prior trauma, not only of being sold into slavery, but the journey of him, his life, comes up before him. And he's confronted with what he thought he had long forgotten and buried in the cotton past. And so the second time, so Joseph tests them and they come before him. And so we pick up at the very beginning of chapter 45. When Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants, and he cried out. And this is when he's revealing himself, the final big reveal of his true identity to his brothers. He says, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Can you imagine the depth of grief, the depth of release? All of that pent up tragedy, pain, suffering, wondering, questioning, doubting, all of that is being released in this moment. And he finally comes to an understanding of making sense of that which has been utterly senseless. And he says in verse 4, and Joseph says to his brother, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, to save your lives by a great deliverance. This is the moment at which, for Joseph, he makes sense. He comes to an understanding and an awareness and the answers to the question, why? I want to use this story to unpack just a few quick misconceptions, I think, about Christian misconceptions about suffering. One is that because we believe in God, we should not suffer. Whether we realize it or not, I think most of us hold this view implicitly. It's only when we really kind of point it out, you kind of go, yeah. If not us, I think most of Christian do, and I think most first-generation Koreans in particular hold on to this view. This notion that if we serve God and if we do things faithful and if we, do the New Start diet, then I shouldn't get cancer. I'm serious. You know how many folks then wonder, why did I get cancer? Why did this person who practiced such a pure Adventist lifestyle and diet, why did they get this? So there is an element at which, at some level or another, we all hold on to this idea because we believe in God or because we do certain things that we should be immune from suffering and pain. And so I think, why me? Why me who worships God? And honestly, what God says to is, why not you? Why not you? And that's something I think we need to come to terms with, that we don't propagate and perpetuate this idea that somehow being a Christian gives you a cosmic insurance policy so that you don't suffer or that tragedies do not happen. If we believe in that view, and if we perpetuate that view, then we are making God into an idol. Now, that might be a confusing idea, but let's really think about that. What is an idol? How can God be an idol? What's an idol? If we deconstruct it beyond just the physical form of it, all idols have some things in common. What are some features of an idol?
They're objects, they're inanimate,
They're objects. Who creates them?
humans, man.
We create something or identify something, and then what do?
Give it to God,
We worship it. What is it? Why do they worship these idols? Think about all the Old Testaments. What is the purpose of worshiping an idol? Why do we appease them? Ultimately, it's so that they will not do bad things to us, but more importantly, that they will give us
What we want.
what we want. So we can turn God into an idol by using him as a cosmic Santa Claus or a cosmic insurance policy. That's when we turn God into an idol. And so many Christians hold on to this view of God as an insurance policy or Santa Claus. So that's one of the things that we need to understand. But beyond that then, what the solution and the answer that God does provide is that true healing does come from God. What enables Joseph to be so gracious? What enables Joseph to forgive his brothers? It's in the passage. What enables him to do that?
Yeah, perspective.
Insight.
Like perspective that God.
There's something so much bigger. When we hurt, we obsess over that. By nature, when anything little hurts, we just become very narrowly focused. It consumes us. Pain consumes us. And when pain consumes us, we lose perspective. And that becomes the all-encompassing thing. I remember being at East Coast camp meeting a number of years ago with my brother's family, and my youngest niece, Kaylin, got some small speck in her eye. And you think, yeah, speck in the eye. But my sister-in-law, who's a pediatrician, she tried, but that thing kept bothering her, and it just became such a thing that bothered her. Not only did it bother her, but because it bothered her daughter so much, she couldn't engage with her friends or do the things that she would normally do. And then the mother became obsessed and concerned because of her concern for her daughter. And so this one tiny little speck in the eye. So finally they took her to an ophthalmologist, and sure enough, there was a tiny little speck. But that little speck consumed, understandably, her and then the mother, until it was removed. And that is such a powerful metaphor for what pain does. It distorts us. It consumes us. It's like cancer. It takes over everything. And we think we can solve it by what? Focusing on it. But in many ways, it can only be solved by something much bigger outside of us. And that is what God provides. He doesn't necessarily take it away, but he gives us a way of understanding, making sense and making meaning of even the senseless. And basically what God says is, I'm God. You know what? I'm not necessarily going to keep you and put you in a bubble where you don't hurt or have any kinds of problems, but I'm going to make it work out somehow. I'm going to make it work out somehow. So that even no matter what it is, at the end, when you look back on it, you're just going to say, oh, you know what? God is bigger, and he has an answer. But what is part of that answer? It is back in verse 7, which is the best part of the story. And God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Whatever we encounter in our lives, this indeed is the insurance. This indeed is the assurance. This is the only kind of assurance that is real, and this is what differentiates us as God-believing, God-fearing people from those who have to rely on luck and fate. And God says, I am in control. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I get the last word on the ending.
Amen.
And he is saying, no matter what happens, no matter what Satan does in the plots and twists and unexpected turns of your life, what God is saying, in the end, I'm going to make it all work out. Not only for you, but for whom? What is Joseph realizing in this?
For his brothers too.
His suffering and what he went through was not only relieved that he became successful, second only to to Pharaoh, yes. But not only did God take care of his pain, but God used him and his suffering and his personal injustice and tragedy to be a great source of blessing and deliverance for an entire region. Can you imagine that? This is what human beings need. You know that we can bear a lot as long as we know that there's hope and that there's meaning. Human beings' capacity to endure the unimaginable and the senseless is amazing, as long as we know that it means something. And that's what God tells us. It is meaningful. It will be for your deliverance, as well as to be a blessing for others. I can tell you that the greatest suffering of my life, and you may see me up here, and you may see my supposedly perfect life, and I have to say, it is now a wonderful life. But all of the things that have brought me here are because of the things in which I have suffered, and the pains. Each of us we live our own movies, and we have our own tragedies, and we have our own pains. And I know that it is God's faithfulness through my pains and my struggles that have directly shaped me to be who I am and to do the work that I do. If I did not suffer in the way that I did, I would not be at all interested in the kinds of things that I do or the ministry that I do. I would be just interested in becoming famous, rich, powerful, all the other things that the world strives for. But everything that I am and everything that I've accomplished, if I look back on it, is because of the pains and the struggles and God's faithfulness to me. So, point number one, God is not a cosmic insurance policy or an idol. True healing and understanding comes through God. And He turns all of our pain and suffering in the end into blessing for ourselves and for others. But there's a but. This is where my wise husband is not here, but I will give him credit. Being a good academic, we have to give credit to where I is. So he said, but you know, we don't always get to know. We don't always get the satisfaction. And there's that kind of suffering that is just senseless. What do we do in that situation? And that's where I go back to my dilemma with Matthew and sitting there with Mike and Francis, and I was really reminded, how can we make sense of suffering? Especially an if and when. And that there are ways in which we don't know if Job ever got a satisfactory answer. Actually, if you read Job, God never answers him. All God does at the end, he says, he kind of bullies Job into submission. Do you know that? Yeah. After God does or allows the unthinkable to happen to Job, in the end, God kind of says, okay, where were you when I created the heavens and the earth? Basically, he kind of says, who do you think you are? To challenge me and ask me and shake your fist at me, basically. And after all of that bullying, Job says, oops. I really did speak about things that I know nothing about. You know? But God never fully answers why all his children died. I mean, think about that. Every single one. I mean, yes, he had more later, but, you know, everything that he had was lost, but God does not offer him an explanation. So in that moment, when we encounter either in the moment or in our lives as a whole, those things that we truly cannot make sense of, then what are we called to do and to be, and how are we called to understand? To that, there's really only one simple but very profound answer. What is God's response to us when we can't make sense out of the senseless? What do you think? Think about that for a bit. I want you to think and struggle about that. Or I give you mine. What is God's answer?
Trust me.
Trust me.
Wait.
I would say that is absolutely true. That's part of the overruling God. Very much so. So I appreciate you to succinctly summarize my whole point up to this point, which is, trust me. But he also says, not only trust me, I'm with you. Now that may seem like a hollow set of words, but you know what? When you are confronted with such human pain, the most useless things are words. I felt that so powerfully. My whole profession is based on words. But you know, in that moment, I just felt like there's nothing I could say. Even my prayers felt so powerless. There are those times in each of our lives when we will be confronted with such pain that words will be utterly useless. And that there's no making sense of what is senseless. And in that moment, God says, I am with you. I am with you. When Job encountered his unthinkable tragedy, what did his friends do? They came and they sat with him. Job could not utter a word. They sat with him in silence. For how long? 1 week. Can you imagine sitting in silence with someone? But that was the depth of that pain. But here's a couple of things that I would like to suggest that we shouldn't do when we are sitting with people in their pain. Okay? One, this is not the time to utter platitudes and say God has a plan for them, or that it is God's will. Let us not presume to speak for God. I think that's one of the most damaging and dangerous things. We can trust that God will bring good things out, but I don't think that we should in any way presume and say things like, because in that moment of pain, it's almost like a slap in the face using God. And I think that does injustice to the person, and it really does injustice to God. And most importantly, it is extremely unhelpful. It is almost like rubbing salt in the wound. So let us not invoke God. We can support them with prayer and encouragement, but let us not try to make sense of meaning out of something that is senseless in that moment when it is so raw. We just don't have enough information. So I would say, let us not at least engage in unhelpful, also assuring them that things will get better, even though that is true, that good things will change and bad things will change as well. But again, this is not the time for platitudes. And ask yourselves, when we say things, and when we do things, I really challenge us to ask, for whom are those things said and done? So many times it is so difficult for us to sit with people's pain. Out of our own discomfort, we will say things and do things to try to do this. Kind of like when a kid's crying, you just try to do everything to get to appease them and get them to settle down. But a lot of things that are said and done when we encounter other people's pain is because of our discomfort and our inability to sit with it. And I would say, when in doubt, just sit with them in silence. Job's friends did the best thing that they could when they just sat with him in silence. It's only when they opened their mouths. Read Job, because you know what? It is all about trying to make sense. It really is. And they tell him from like, you must have done something bad. Well, something must have happened. It's all sense-making. Their attempts to make sense of something that was utterly senseless at that point. And that's where, however well-intended they were, the intent didn't really come to fruition in what is helpful. So, my final kind of point of this message is really a very simple, but a most profound one. And that in the midst of whatever it is that we struggle with in life, whether it's deep, big tragedies, or even the smallest things of just dealing with loneliness. brokenness even in our own marriages, when you're struggling with that, when you're struggling with disappointment, any kind of hopelessness and despair, what we have as Christians is God's assurance. He says, I am with you. I am with you. And I want to read you a couple of texts that really focus on this. So as we enter into the Advent season, so we're December 1. I already have my Christmas tree up. I love Christmas so much. Many of you know. A little bit of a Christmas geek. And we know, it's a trite saying, that the true spirit of the season gets lost. And that's why I wanted to loop in the good news of the gospel. The good news of the gospel. And to connect it to this Advent season with this Messianic prophecy from Isaiah 61. This is Jesus's mandate and mission that was prophesied about Jesus. And it says, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. And I would say prisoners of hopelessness and despair. To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, hope, and the day of vengeance of our God. To comfort all who mourn, and to provide for those who grieve in Zion, and to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, an oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. This was why Jesus was sent. He could have been a God who was content to just live among the heavens with the adoring angels. He didn't have to come down and humble himself to take on human form, to be lonely, to be looked down upon, to be misunderstood, and to do what? Ultimately die, accused of being what? He was falsely accused and crucified for the thing that he actually was. He was the Son of God. And we could not fathom that the Son of God would actually come and take on human form and humble himself in such a way and be willing to die on a cross. This Christmas season is about Emmanuel, God with us. And that is God's ultimate and final answer to the problem of our suffering, whether we can make sense of it now or not. God with us.
Amen.
So I've asked Kevin to do our closing song and singing the Christmas carol.